Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Okay, so now we are, we're testing a new technology today. I'm no longer in the Murrieta studios. David is there, but I am on Skype, and we're going to see whether we have a good enough sound quality. But today is going to be part 3 of Scared Stiff, of our podcast about anxiety. And today we're going to be looking at the cognitive model, one of the 4 main models that David talked about last time. And so the cognitive model is when our thinking gives rise to our anxiety, David, right?
Yes, in fact, I would say that in virtually all cases, anxiety results from these negative thoughts, telling ourselves that we're in danger and that some terrible thing is about to happen to us. But we have 4 tremendously powerful but radically different treatment models for treating anxiety. And so today we'll be looking at the cognitive model, and the idea is that the moment you stop believing the negative thoughts that are triggering your anxiety, in that very moment the anxiety will disappear. And I'm going to give an example of a woman struggling with 10 years of refractory horrific panic attacks and extremely severe depression, who had failed to respond to years of psychotherapy and years of medication therapy for her panic attacks. And this example will make the cognitive model tremendously clear to our listeners. So shall we dive right in, Fabrice?
Yes, so let's dive right in.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have fun with today's podcast and find it interesting. It was one of the, going to describe one of the most dramatic therapy sessions that I've ever had. The woman, let's give her a name, call her Terry, was a woman who came to me for treatment after 10 years of horrific panic attacks. That's one of the most dramatic forms of anxiety. And if you've never had a panic attack, what happens is it just suddenly out of the blue, you have one of several kinds of negative thoughts that you really believe. Like the one Terry would have during her panic attacks is that I'm about to pass out or die of a heart attack, and I'll explain more why she would have this kind of thought. But the fact is, if you right now had the belief that you were on the verge of a heart attack and about to die, you would feel very panicky, and that thought would be the cause of your panic. Terry's first panic attack came on when she was on vacation on vacation with her husband in Jamaica, and on our next one of the upcoming podcasts, when we talk about the hidden emotion model, I'll tell you what happened on that vacation, what brought it all about in the first place. Maybe we'll have time to do that today, but the bottom line is she was hyperventilating. Her chest got tight. She got pain in her chest. She felt she wasn't breathing deeply enough. Her fingers started tingling, and she had the thought, "I'm about to die," and that caused tremendous panic. Typically, the panic attack disappears just as mysteriously as it came on after about 20 minutes, and leaving the patient or the individual feeling terrified and bewildered and worried about when the next panic attack is going to come. Another thought that individuals might have that triggers a panic attack, they might start hyperventilating, getting upset about something, and then begin to feel dizzy and tell themselves, I'm about to go crazy, I'm about to go insane. And that also can trigger a massive panic attack that lasts about 20 minutes or so. Other people with panic attacks have the thought when they're like eating in public that they're about to get sick and start vomiting on people, lose control in that way. Or some people get worried that they're going to lose control and pee in their pants in public, or lose control of their bowels and poop in their pants and in public. But these thoughts are terrifying to people because they totally believe them, and the distress they have is enormous. Well, Terry began, going to emergency rooms when she'd have these panic attacks, and the emergency rooms, they'd do EKG and other tests and reassure her that everything was fine, or refer her to a cardiologist, and she'd be reassured for 2 or 3 days, and then she'd have another panic attack. And she got to where she was having about 5 of them a week. And after 5 years of this, somebody finally made the diagnosis of panic disorder and referred her to a psychiatrist. And it boggles my mind how it can take people so long to catch on to a panic attack, but that's what happens. People keep thinking it's a medical disorder of some kind, which it's not. Then the psychiatrist started prescribing medications and more medications and raising the doses, and none of them were effective. And at the time she came to me, she was on, probably 5 different extremely powerful medications, none of which had helped. She also had psychotherapy that didn't help, and when she finally she was happily married. There were no real problems in Terry's life. She had 4 beautiful children, and she told her psychiatrist that she and her husband wanted to have a 5th child. And he said, "Oh, well, you're going to have to go off all of these medications, and because they could cause a birth defect." And this angered her. Because she was afraid to go off the medication. She was also angry that they'd never helped, and rather than express her angry feeling, she was a very kind of nice, polite person, and you see that in most people with anxiety disorders. She didn't express her feeling. She just stopped going to that psychiatrist, and then she saw my book, Feeling Good, the drug-free, treatment for depression, and thought, well, gosh, maybe he can help me, and noticed that my office was not far from where she lived, so she came in for an evaluation, and that was the background. And I gave her my brief mood survey, and her scores at the time. I had the depression and anxiety test norm to go from 0 to 100. They were longer versions than the ones I use now, and I remember she had a 99 on one of the tests and a 98 on the other. And I had never seen a person who was that severely depressed and anxious up to that point in my career. Now, do you have any questions or anything, Fabrice, before I go rambling on and explain what happened?
Actually, I was thinking earlier that when you were talking about the panic attacks, and I don't want to bring us back, 5 minutes ago, but it sounded to me like when you talk about a panic attack, there's a sort of a vicious circle where you start having a thought that creates your anxiety, and then the anxiety kind of reinforces the thought, and you say, oh yes, well, I knew it, I am going to die, or I am going to get sick. And then that makes you more anxious, which makes you feel even more sick, and so on. You have like this vicious circle that is like a tightening spiral. Isn't that right?
That's exactly correct. The negative thought, I'm going to die, or I'm about to go crazy, creates feelings of panic and anxiety, and then you reason, my gosh, I'm so scared, I must be on the verge of something terrible. And so the anxiety triggers those parts of the brain that generate more negative thoughts, and so you go into this kind of tornado of intense negativity.
Yeah. Isn't that like the distortion that we had talked about before, the emotional reasoning?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and then also the fortune telling. You're predicting that something awful's about to happen, and then you get anxious, and your anxiety, you reason from your anxiety, saying, "I'm so anxious, it must be true that I'm in incredible danger," and you don't realize that the whole thing is due to distortions. It seems so real, you can't imagine that you're fooling yourself in some way.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, well, thank you. It sounds like this is a self-fulfilling prophecy that we get into.
Yeah. Most anxiety does function as a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. So go on with Terry's story.
Okay. Well, when I'm working with people, I always work in a very specific way. I have them fill out what we call the daily mood log, and I say, describe one moment you were upset that you want my help. And what happens with Terry is she gets upset about something and starts to hyperventilate like that, and she doesn't realize that she's hyperventilating. And if you hyperventilate like that for a minute or two deeply, listeners can try it if you're interested right now. Go. You'll notice that after 15 or 30 seconds, you get dizzy, your fingers tingle, your chest might get tight, and then you would have the thought, oh, this is a fun experiment that Dr. Burns had me do. But people who are prone to panic attacks make a different interpretation, and she tells herself, my windpipe is about to close off, I'm about to die, I'm about to pass out. And she believes those thoughts 100%. So she wrote them down in the negative thoughts column at my suggestion, and indicated her belief in all of those is 100% at the beginning of a panic attack. And then she circled all of her negative feelings, which were depressed 100%, panicky 100%, ashamed 100%, every hopeless, helpless, inadequate, inferior, alone. Every negative feeling you can imagine in the 90 to 100% range. The only one that wasn't 100% was anger, and that was just 25%. Now, from a cognitive therapy perspective, that's one of 4 powerful models for fighting anxiety. Those negative thoughts cause the panic. The thought, I'm about to die, causes the panic. What would have to happen, Fabrice, for her panic to suddenly disappear?
She would have to stop believing those thoughts.
That's exactly correct. But how are we going to get her to do that? Because she's had tons of therapy from many compassionate and probably reasonably skillful therapists, and many doctors have worked her up for her chest and lungs and tried to reassure her, and no one was successful in getting her to stop believing that thought. Every time she has a panic attack, she again believes this is the real thing. So I developed what I call a recovery circle. It's a circle with 16 arrows heading out of it.
Is
and in
it
the
okay?
middle, I put the.
Is it okay if I put this on the show notes so that people can see what the recovery circle looks like?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we can. I can even probably send you a PowerPoint with one of hers. It only has 12 arrows, which to simplify it for the PowerPoint, but they'll get the idea.
That'd be
and
great.
At the end, go ahead.
That'd be great. Yes, if you could do that.
And at the end of the each arrow, I put the name of one of the techniques I'm going to use to help her challenge this thought, like identify the distortions, examine the evidence, the paradoxical double standard technique, the downward arrow technique, self-monitoring, on and on and on. And the idea is that I don't know which technique is going to be helpful for her, and so I will have to fail as fast as I can with her permission and trying technique after technique until I find the one that's effective. So I began working with Terry, and she did her psychotherapy homework. She gave me perfect empathy ratings after each session, but for the first 5 sessions, nothing improved. She continued having 5 panic attacks every week, and continue believing at the start of each panic attack, I'm about to die. I had tried 4 or 5 techniques each session that had not been effective. So at this point, I had tried 15 or 16 or 17 techniques.
That must have been discouraging.
No, it wasn't discouraging to me because in those days, now we can get much faster results. But in those days, I nearly always got a good outcome, but it typically took 15, 20, or 25 techniques before I would find the one that works. Now we have a way of shortcutting all of that to vastly accelerate the treatment. But to me, it was kind of par for the course. And it's also kind of fun for me because it's like playing a chess game and eventually you're going to win the game, but you're against a great chess master. And so it's challenging to find the method that will dramatically change someone's life and heal their horrible suffering. And it's a joy. It's a fantastic joy when you see that happen. I always enjoyed my clinical work. I never got burned out or discouraged. The only thing that ever bothered me is if I felt like I made a mistake and hurt somebody's feelings, and that was always horribly, horribly painful for me. But other than that, I always loved the challenge of treating someone. Well, around the 5th session, I told Terry, I said, look, we've tried 15, 16 techniques. We seem to have a great therapeutic relationship. You're motivated. You do the homework, but we're totally stuck. And with your permission, next session, I'd like to use a very powerful technique called the experimental technique. And it's arguably the most powerful technique ever developed for the treatment of anxiety. And the only thing about it is that you'd have to give me permission to induce an actual panic attack in the session, at the start of the session. And then when you're at the height of your symptoms, I'm going to show you how to use this powerful experimental technique. Well, she said that sounded like it was a wonderful idea. She was a very sweet, nice, agreeable individual. And then canceled the next 2 therapy sessions. She called in each week and to tell me that she wasn't dropping out of therapy and that she really, appreciated the work that I was doing with her. But did she have to have a panic attack in the session? She said it was so terrifying to her. And if there's any other way, she was begging me, not to use this technique. And I said, Terry, I'd never do anything to violate your trust or to hurt you. I'd never do anything against your will. But I'd really like to persuade you to do this. And if you'd like, I'll make it a double session so we have plenty of time to induce the panic attack and use the technique and process it and understand what happened. But I said, look at it this way, Terry. You've been in therapy for 10 years and nothing has helped you. And you're having 5 horrible panic attacks at home every week anyway. Why not have one more here in the hospital where maybe we can do something about it and end your suffering once and for all? And after all, the emergency room is just down the hallway from my office. So I think you'll be pretty safe. And I'm hoping to persuade you to face your fear, and give it a try. And so she finally consented to come in. And at the beginning of the session, and she was quite terrified, and the way I induced the panic attack in her case, it might be induced in different ways with different people, but I just said, Terry, I want you to close your eyes and start hyperventilating. And as soon as you begin to feel the tingling and the tightness in your chest and the dizziness, just wiggle your right index finger. So I'll know it's starting to happen. And after 15 or 20 seconds, she wiggled her right index finger, and then I began speaking to her, and I said, now Terry, I'm going to be that voice in your mind, the negative thoughts that trigger your panic. So I'm the negative Terry, And what I'm telling you right now is notice how tight your chest feels, and you can't breathe deeply enough, and you're not getting enough air in your lungs, and maybe your windpipe is going to close off, and you're going to get a heart attack, and we're going to have to call for the paramedics, and can you visualize them now? And you can't breathe, and they're panicking, and they're giving you oxygen, but even that isn't working, and your lips are turning blue, and your fingernails are turning blue because you can't get enough oxygen in your blood, and now you're starting to have a heart attack, and they're putting you in the ambulance, and you can see the red light going around on the top, and that type of thing. And
so you're creating a multisensory experience there, really.
Yeah, kind of like negative hypnosis, you might say. In fact, all anxiety is a form of self-hypnosis. And I was just entering into the hypnotic trance she creates for herself every time she has a panic attack. And of course, the goal isn't to make her miserable, but to give her the opportunity for dramatic healing. But this triggered a massive panic attack, and she began babbling almost incoherently, and she started begging me to stop. And one thing in workshops I say to therapists, and I show a video of this because I actually had a video going at the time, so I can show this actual thing unfolding before people's very eyes. And I ask therapists, if you were the therapist now, and she's sobbing, tears are going down your cheeks, and she's begging me, please, Dr. Burns, I've changed my mind. I'm about to die. I can't take this. This is real. I know I'm about to have a heart attack. And I say, what would you have done? Would you have backed off, or would you have pushed ahead?
No, you need to push ahead.
Yeah, well, that's what I did. Most therapists say they would back off at that point. They'd be terrified, and of course we want to empathize and provide warmth and support when someone is so horribly suffering and terrified. But this is one exception of the case where the most merciful thing might be to push ahead. So I told her, Terry, I'm going to ask you to stick with it here, and she was barely paying attention to what I was saying, and she just kept saying, please, I can't go on. Now, she has the thought, I'm going to die. Now, the experimental method goes back to the work of Aaron Beck. He viewed depressed and anxious patients as scientists who have a theory that's incorrect. And so just as we can have scientists do experiments to test what their theory is, Beck thought we could encourage patients to do experiments to test their negative thoughts and their beliefs. And so what I said to Terry was, Terry, let me ask you a question. If you were about to die of a heart attack right now, do you think you could do strenuous aerobic exercises? And she says, she seemed confused, and she says, no, I'm about to die. I couldn't do that. And I said, well, let's do an experiment. Let's check it out. I'd like you to stand up and do some running in place. And she said, no, even if I stand up, I'm going to pass out. And I said, well, let's do an experiment and check that out. I want you to stand up right now. And she stood up, and of course she didn't pass out. I knew she wouldn't, because you faint when your heart slows down, and when you have a drop in blood pressure, you get that with like blood phobia. But when someone's having a panic attack, their heart is speeding up and they have higher blood pressure, so she couldn't possibly faint, and she didn't. And I said, now I'd like you to start running in place. So she started out very gingerly, very slowly, and saying, oh, Dr. Burns, my heart is about to stop. I can't breathe deeply enough. My windpipe is closing off. Please, Dr. Burns, I can't do this. I'm about to die. And then I said, well, run a little faster then. So she speeds up in her running, and she keeps trying to persuade me that she's on the verge of death, and you know, she can't keep doing this, and her heart is about to fail. And after a minute or so, she stops and says, oh, Dr. Burns, I can't go on. This is too much for me. And then I said, well, try some jumping jacks then. And she said, oh no, I couldn't possibly do any jumping jacks. I'm about to die. And I said, well, try some jumping jacks anyway. So she gives in and she starts doing some jumping jacks. And about 15 seconds into the jumping jacks, she blurted out, I wonder if I could really do this if I was having a heart attack. And then I said, is this what you see in the emergency rooms of hospitals? Patients with massive heart attacks standing next to their gurneys doing jumping jacks.
That's funny.
And when I said that, she burst out laughing uncontrollably and doubled over. And you could see the change in her affect in just a flash from sobbing and terror to uncontrollable laughing. And the reason that change happened at that moment is it suddenly dawned on her that it couldn't possibly be true that she was having a heart attack. And then she stood back up and I said, do some more jumping jacks now. I'm sure you'll pass out at any moment. And then she doubled over laughing again. And then she blurted out, I'm feeling a lot better now. And that was the end of 10 years of intractable suffering. And the neat thing is you can see her recovery on the video. It makes believers out of therapists at workshops, because when I tell them that you can see patients recover in minutes before your very eyes, they think I'm a nut or a con artist. And then when they see it, it has a stunning effect and heartwarming as well. Well, I asked her to sit down and explain to her what had happened, and that her suffering was because she had been telling herself for 10 years something that just was not true. And the reason she suddenly felt so much better is that when she did the jumping jacks and the running in place, it suddenly dawned on her that the negative thought, I'm about to die, was not true. And the very instant she stopped believing that thought, her feelings of anxiety disappeared. And then I said to her, now, just to show you that this wasn't a fluke and this was real, I'd like your permission to repeat it and to induce a second panic attack and show you the same phenomenon working again. And that way you'll be able to do this anytime you want or need for the rest of your life. And so she graciously allowed me to induce a second panic attack. I had her close her eyes, hyperventilate, wiggle your finger when you can feel the tingling and the pain and the dizziness. And in 15 seconds, she wiggled her finger. And then I said, now imagine that you're about to die. Your windpipe is closing off. You're about to have a heart attack, the same kind of stuff. And it triggered a massive panic attack, every bit as severe as the previous one. And she started begging me and saying, Dr. Burns, this time it's real, but please stop. I can't go on. I know this is a real heart attack. And then I said, well, if you were having a heart attack right now, could you stand up and do some strenuous jumping jacks? And she said, no, even if I stand up, I know I'm going to pass out. It was as if she couldn't even remember what had just happened. It was amazing. She was sobbing and pleading. So I pushed her and I said, let's stand up, give it a try, let's see what happens. So she courageously stood up, and of course she didn't pass out. And then I said, now I'd like you to do some jumping jacks. And she started very gingerly. I said, come on, get it into it now. This is the Olympics. You've got to bring on that heart attack. Give it everything you've got. And she started doing real fast, energetic jumping jacks. And after about 20 seconds, she said, I wonder if I could do this if I was having a heart attack. And then I repeated the same line I'd used before. Is this what you see in emergency rooms of people with having heart attacks? And she burst into uncontrollable laughing and sat down. And that was the end of, 10 years of suffering. And the reason I did it twice So there's a difference between feeling better and getting better. The first time she didn't really comprehend how it had worked. The second time it became crystal clear to her. Now, I have one last addition to the story here, but any questions you have or things you want to add in the meantime, Fabrice?
No, we'll kind of debrief this after you complete the story. There's some things that this is bringing up for me.
Oh, okay, great. Then she said to me, "Well, now, Dr. Burns, what happens if I get a panic attack between sessions?" And I said, "Well, that's why I've been having you do psychotherapy homework, so you can learn to be your own shrink and not have to keep coming forever to therapy." And we tried 17 techniques that didn't work. We now found the technique that does work, and this technique will work for the rest of your life. And so if you get a panic attack at home between sessions, you just do your jumping jacks exactly the way you did it here. And then she said, "Yeah, but how about if I'm driving down the freeway?" And I said, "You pull your car over by the side of the road and you get out and you start doing jumping jacks." Now, a lot of patients with anxiety have intense shame. And Terry was one of those, and she was very ashamed of her symptoms. And one of the fears she told me at the initial evaluation was that the neighbors might find out that she had depression and anxiety and panic attacks and think she was some kind of a mental case. And so when I told her to do jumping jacks next to her car, she said, "Oh, Dr. Burns, I could never do that. The word would get around. People would think I'm a nutcase, and the word would spread. That would be impossible for me, Dr. Burns." So I said, "Oh, Terry, are you saying that you couldn't do something bizarre or foolish in public?" And she says, "Oh, Dr. Burns, absolutely. I could never do something like that." And so just on impulse, I opened the door to my office. And now the session was only half over. So she didn't know how I did that. And then I walked out into the waiting room, and she looked and she could see I was in the middle of the waiting room. She couldn't see all of the waiting room, but I started doing jumping jacks and going, with my lip and shouting out, I'm a crazy guy. I'm doing jumping jacks in my waiting room, things like that. And then I went in and back into the office and closed the office door. And I said to Terry, what do you think of that? And she says, "Dr. Burns, if you've got the courage to make a total ass of yourself in front of all of your patients, that gives me the courage to do what I've got to do to beat this thing. God bless you, Dr. Burns." And what I didn't tell her was that the waiting room was entirely empty at the time, but she was very, very impressed with that demonstration. And she came back to me 2 weeks later, and she looked like a different person. In fact, I didn't recognize her. Her appearance had changed so dramatically. She had been on a kind of a weight loss diet, and she came in the session when we did the jumping jack. She was not dressed in a very attractive way, and I don't mean that critically, but when people are horribly depressed, often the outer reflects the inner. And when she came back 2 weeks later, I thought she was a model from a modeling agency doing, some kind of photographic work for the hospital. And so I introduced myself to her, and she says, "Dr. Burns, don't you know who I am?" And I said, I don't believe we've met. And she says, "I'm Terry, your patient." And it was mind-blowing. She looked like the cover of Vogue magazine or Cosmopolitan magazine, and her scores were 0 on the depression and anxiety test. She was more than 100% recovered. I mean, she was really, really in a state of euphoria. Now, that recording was made in 1988, and I've had to contact her every year or two to say, can I have permission to continue showing the video in my workshops, because mental health professionals still seem to get a lot of benefit by watching it, and she always says the same thing. And most recently, she said she'd gone ahead. She'd had her 5th child. Most of the children are grown and graduated from college now. She's become a novelist and has had 2 successful novels that she's published, and she's been just feeling tremendous. How 88, 98, 98, 108, it's almost 28 years or something like that. She said she had only one panic attack during that period of time, and she was thinking of scheduling an emergency session, but then she did her jumping jacks and it immediately disappeared. So that's the cognitive model in all of its glory, and it's not a simple thing, because different people respond to different techniques, and I've developed tremendous numbers of cognitive techniques. But I just hung up the phone there. I hope the person won't be insulted. I didn't want to interfere with her recording here. But that was a really heartwarming thing, and shows the power of the cognitive model. The moment you change the way you're thinking, in that very instant, you'll feel differently. We'll let the phone ring here for a minute, but maybe my wife will get it, or the answering machine. I apologize for the phone in the background. Okay, now it'll go on to the answering machine. Okay, but let's process it a little bit, Fabrice.
Yes, so this brings up some questions for me. I think that, to begin with, your anecdote was very powerful and also very funny. I like the way this turned out. So what I'm thinking is some clinicians may go, well, yeah, it's all well and good, because yes, it's true that a lot of people who have panic attacks think they're going to die. But it's not true for everyone. Sometimes they just are afraid they're going to look foolish, and so of course they may say, "Well, I am looking foolish. See, I knew it," and so they would reinforce the thoughts that way.
Yeah. Well, before you go on, let's just address that very important point. The techniques that we've developed in team therapy and, formerly cognitive therapy are very powerful. And just as a technique has the power to heal somebody quickly, that same technique has the power to hurt somebody if it's not done with skill and compassion and thoughtfulness. And that's why you can't just go around throwing these techniques at people, because you can hurt patients with these techniques. It's a lot like having a surgeon's scalpel, and that scalpel can be used to cut out a ruptured appendix and save your life. A trained surgeon can do that, but that same scalpel in the hands of a mugger could be used to slit someone's throat and kill them. And so I don't mean to give the impression that you can, irresponsibly go throwing these fancy techniques around and hope to get a good result. Learning team therapy requires a tremendous amount of training and discipline and skill and compassion as well. And for each patient, the treatment has to be individualized, and the patient might not respond to the experimental technique. They might respond to the compassion-based technique, like the double standard technique, or the acceptance paradox, or the externalization of voices, or the hidden emotion model. I'll bring to life radically different strategies that can be just as powerful in treating anxiety. You need to have many different treatment tools. One other thing is that the purpose of the vignette is not that exercise is good treatment for depression or anxiety. The only reason the exercise was helpful is because it disproved her negative thought that she was about to die. Now, if, let's say, she had a panic attack but had the thought that triggered the panic, I'm about to go crazy, well, then jumping jacks wouldn't have helped her. The experiment would have to be radically different. Fabrice, can you think of an experiment that might help a patient who, at the height of a panic attack, has the belief, I'm about to go crazy?
Well, you could ask that person a judgment question, like some kind of a mini mental status exam.
Yeah, that's one approach some therapists use. Is they will put a patient with panic attacks in a spinning chair and say, how anxious can I make you? And well, here's our trusty phone again. Maybe next time we do this, I'll unplug the phone. I don't know how to do that right now. Maybe I can. Oh, I think my wife picked it up there. Where was I? I was talking about
talking about
the belief that you're going to go crazy.
How are you going to disprove this? Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Some therapists use a kind of mild experimental technique, as they'll put a patient in a chair. Usually they get dizzy and then think they're going crazy. So the therapist will say, how dizzy am I allowed to make you? And they might say, well, 75%. And so you put them in like a secretarial chair that spins and spin them around, and they raise their hand when they're 75% anxious. And then the therapist would say, now, what's the thought that is upsetting you? And the patient say, I think I'm on the verge of going crazy. And then you might say, now, if you were going crazy, do you think you could read a sentence from a book and explain what the sentence means, or do you think that you could, in the old days we used to say, call up information on the telephone and ask for someone's telephone number, or do you think you could count backwards from 100 type of thing, and then the person does these experiments and discovers that they can do these things, and hopefully that reduces the belief and the idea that they're going crazy. I prefer a more powerful and convincing approach, similar to what we did with Terry. What I've had patients do is ask them, if you were going to go crazy, let's say today, I treated an elderly woman who had had 53 years of panic attacks and agoraphobia because of her fear that she would go crazy. And the thing that helped her in the fifth therapy session, I said, now, Melinda, let's assume that you finally crack up today. What would that look like? What are we talking about? She said, I'd be rolling around on the floor, or maybe on my back like a turtle on its back, and my arms and legs would be flailing, and I'd be screaming incoherently and quacking like a duck and talking in tongues, and then I'd get up and swirl like a swirling dervish, and I'd be singing and shouting and, pounding my head against the wall. So I said, well, let's go for it. You've been running away from this thing your entire life. Let's see if you can drive yourself crazy right now. And this terrified her, and she says, "No way, Jose! I refuse to do that." And then we argued back and forth. And now again, you've got to have perfect empathy ratings from your patients to do these extreme techniques. They require trust, and they can't be done with sarcasm or a lack of warmth and support and compassion. Finally, she says, Dr. Burns, I've agreed to do what you're asking me to do, but on one condition. And I said, what's that, Melinda? She said, you go first. So I said, okay, no problem. So I lay on my back and on the rug in the office. I started shouting and screaming and flailing my arms around. And then I got up and swirled like a whirling dervish and wiggled my hips and babbled incoherently and sang and shouted and acted as crazy as I could. And I would peek at her from time to time, and I could see that she was really, really enjoying the show. And then I sat down and I said, okay, Melinda, now it's your turn. And so she is a 73-year-old woman. She's been struggling with this since she was 18 years old, and 55 years of failed therapy for panic attacks and agoraphobia, fear of leaving home alone for fear of having a panic attack and going crazy in the grocery store or some such thing. That was what was driving the system. So she carefully arranged her dress. She used to come dressed very formally to sessions, almost like in evening gowns. And a lot of fancy furniture or fancy, not furniture, but, jewelry. So she lay down, she adjusted everything, got her dress just adjusted properly. Then she moved her right arm and leg and said, woo, and then her left arm and leg and said, woo. I apologize for the phone. And I said, Melinda, this isn't going to cut it. This is the Olympics of psychosis. You've got to throw everything you have into it, give it all you've got. Try to bring on a psychotic episode. So then she really got into it and started screaming at the top of her lungs and flailing her arms and legs about and singing and whooping and babbling incoherently. She got up and she swirled like a swirling dervish and acted just crazy for 2 minutes, and then she sat down, and I said, what do you think, Melinda? And she says, Dr. Burns, for 55 years, I've been, hanging on to my sanity, terrified and fearing that I could snap and go crazy at any moment. And I just discovered that I can't go crazy no matter how hard I try. I have never felt more in control than I do at this very moment. And then I said, why don't you take the anxiety test again right now? And that's why I like having these little 5-item scales, because patients can complete them in 15 seconds and total them up. And just as I imagined, her score had dropped to 0, and she had had a total recovery from her panic disorder. And again, she came in one more session to terminate therapy. We did some relapse prevention work, and that was it. And so that's a very different way of using the experimental technique. And then if a patient is depressed, you might do yet a radically different kind of experiment. And then for many patients, the experimental technique might not be the thing that does it for them.
Yes, it's true that every patient has their own type of response, and it's clear that having this little description that you just gave will give people a sense of what's possible, but it does require quite a bit of training to become proficient at using those techniques. They're not. Yeah. They're not something you can just pick up and use without any prior practice.
Absolutely, and supervision, training. We have a lot of tools for therapists who are interested. Weekly small group webinars to practice and learn these techniques under supervision. There's my psychotherapy ebook, Tools, Not Schools of Therapy. On my website, feelinggood.com, there are tremendous resources for therapists who would like to learn more about these new methods for treating depression and anxiety.
So I think that we've made quite a long podcast today. We probably should start wrapping up. But in summary, it sounds like So you can use the cognitive approach to work with anxiety, and you give the example of panic attacks. But I assume that you can do this with other types of anxiety that are not necessarily leading to this paroxysmal type of attack.
Yeah, there's many ways to defeat the negative thoughts, but you always start with the daily mood log. What's one moment that you're anxious? It could be a public speaking anxiety, shyness, whatever. And what are your feelings at that moment? And what are the negative thoughts? Then we take a negative thought, put it in the middle of a recovery circle, choose 15 or 20 techniques from my list of 50 ways to untwist your thinking, and then go through the techniques one by one until you find the one that smashes the negative thoughts and allows the patient to recover. And each person will have their own path to enlightenment, so to speak. But the cognitive model is a very powerful one. And then in upcoming podcasts, we'll talk about the exposure model,
right,
the hidden emotion model, and the motivational model as well.
Yeah. Yes, and I'm looking forward to recording those. So make sure to send me that example of Terry's recovery circle so that I can put this up in the show notes.
That sounds great, and thank you, Fabrice. It's always a joy working with you, and I hope people enjoyed today's podcast and grasped some of the basic ideas behind cognitive behavior therapy and what we now call team CBT.
I'm sure they will, and we did a little bit of exposure ourselves, but by showing our technical difficulties in in this case. But all right. Well, I'm looking forward to the next one. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Fabrice. Always a joy to work with you. It's a highlight of my week.
Thank you so much.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donzel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.